We're back here with Matt Barker. We've done a bunch of podcasts in the past with Matt. And we're going to have a general discussion about a whole bunch of stuff that's been going on. Matt's been looking at some of Sen McGinn's, pro-Baha'i propaganda against Iran. But first of all, Matt, I wanted to ask you about your opinion about the reemergence of Gomer on talk religion Baha'i. What's your opinion?
To me, it's just it's silly, really. I mean, the guy, he's not only not too bright, he just plain lacks observation. Because I thought things were pretty much okay. He was shutting up for a while, and then he sent me that message that he was back, and after you and Steven going at him for a while, I interjected, and I don't think he even realized that it was me, because he was paying, because the way he worded his response was as if I were you. He hadn't even paid attention to the fact that there was a different name there. It just shows a lot of self-absorption, not to mention just the lack of observation. I will refute his stuff, when, he goes after you and Steven and that sort of thing, but he's just silly.
Yeah, and he's also, we kind of suspect he's not well, if you know what I mean. Those videos that he put up of himself, especially the last one he did about me, kind of indicate that this guy is mentally ill. Just the way he talks. I don't know if he's got any counter to anything what we say, but he really embarrassed himself. Not once now. He did accede to the fact that he got it wrong on the Soviet-British invasion of Iran in 1941. So, but, like I said to Stephen yesterday, if this guy's in the closet, come out, liberate yourself, maybe get out of Texas, or if you don't want to stay in Texas, there are arms ready to embrace you in the form of Michael Zargarov. So go to him and chill the fuck out, as where we're concerned. Anyway, let's put all of that behind us now. Yeah. This is pretty much a done deal. You've been looking at Sen McGinn's blog in the last couple of weeks during this whole coronavirus.
Someone else posted it, and I'll actually call it up right here. But supposedly, he's trying to say that he admits the story is a hodgepodge, and yeah, it is. It's pretty pathetically thrown together. That, quote, state-sponsored media in Iran have been repeating the story that appears to have been invented by the Islamic Republic News Agency, TN News, and popularized by the Young Journalists Club, a government agency affiliated with the state broadcaster, dated March 26th, blah, 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 blah. That supposedly Baha'is at Stanford are supposed to be preparing biological weapons, the whole bit. Now, if you actually click on this Young Journalist Club that he highlights, it actually just sends you to a Wikipedia page on who they are. If you tap on TN News, it sends you to their main page, not to the article they supposedly printed. But if you actually go and you do a Google search, what you get is there's actually a TV clip with, it's in Persian, but it's got subtitles and it's got the script below it. It's on Memory TV, which is Middle Eastern something, news network. And what it actually says, is one doctor on the show. All he says is, we're talking about something that I am now suggesting exists, ethnic weapons. These are biological weapons that cause higher mortality rates among certain races. From the molecular biological perspective, this is not strange at all. The question is, was this virus altered? So they're debating whether or not this was a natural or created virus with SARS-CoV-2. Was the genome of this virus built in a way that makes it easier for it to attach itself to the receptors of a genetic identity and cause an epidemic? Iran is the third most infected country after China and South Korea. Granted, this is actually dated this is actually from March 10th. So that,
now the United States, Spain and the United States are now fast. Percentage-wise, going above Italy and China.
Oh yeah.
So look, I did that podcast with Dr. Kevin Barrett. I like Dr. Kevin Barrett, but Kevin Barrett is on this whole, COVID-19 is a bioweapon shtick. And I fundamentally disagree with this. I mean, I've listened to all of these podcasts between the guests that he's had. And look, if you deploy a bioweapon of this magnitude, you have done scenario planning, game planning way in advance, if you're a government. Now, it's possible that a lot of these people who are on the whole conspiracy theory shtick about COVID-19 haven't actually looked at the possibility that we're not maybe even talking about a state actor. If this is a bioweapon, that it could be a corporate actor who stands to benefit from something. Because, a lot of these people who are analyzing the whole conspiracy theory milieu at the moment are blaming governments. And I think this is where a lot of the problems in their analysis emerges, is because they actually think that governments are still the overriding power on this planet, and they're not. The power on this planet today is with corporations and with private enterprise. It's with capital. It is not with government. Governments are beholden to these corporations. And more often than not, as implicitly these Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, etc., have proven, corporations and big multinational corporations oftentimes have much more state-of-the-art and sophisticated security capabilities and what have you than even some governments out there. So this is something that these people have not looked at. Nevertheless, I am not convinced by any stretch of the imagination that this was a bioweapon. The reasoning about the bioweapon thing, it kind of misses a lot of different elements that kind of exclude that argument. Number one, if this is a bioweapon and it was deployed on China, it was deployed in China as a way of handicapping the Chinese, then these people miscalculated, because if you take down China, if you weaken China, you're basically creating a big dent in the global economy. And if the global economy is dented and is brought down, then the very actors that deployed this bioweapon stand to be screwed pretty royally by the blowback from such a bioweapon. None of these people are looking at this. Is it an act of terrorism? Could it be that some unknown terrorist organization out there got a hold of this, of strains of the COVID-19 and then released it into the public? That's very possible. But if that's so, then you still have to exclude state actors, because these terrorist organizations are either usually, acting alone, or if they're acting by the prodding of a state actor, that state actor in this particular situation would have a lot to lose by prodding this organization to release this virus. The other thing that we have to realize is that a lot of these conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and 5G, etc., are animated by extreme paranoia, right? Which the internet has generated, but none of the people who are who are peddling these conspiracy theories have an iota of understanding about, number one, science, and number two, none of these people seem to understand the historical trajectory of these conspiracies, where they come from, who stands to benefit from propagating these conspiracy theories, etc. Now, that said, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I said this to you before we went on air, Iran was not prepared by any stretch of the imagination for this pandemic, right? A lot of this has to do with the sanctions that have been on Iran. But most of the rest of it has to do with mismanagement of the healthcare system in Iran by the government itself, right? And because such large numbers of Iranians have been taken by the coronavirus, right? The system, the government, and the interest groups that are associated with the Iranian government are desperately trying to seek a scapegoat in this particular situation, because so that they can placate their own constituency from the fact that it was their negligence, their lack of duty of care, the fact that the public healthcare system in Iran is completely shut to hell and has been shut to hell for a long time, that there are two parallel societies in Iran and have been over the last 20 years, where people with money and people, close to the proximity of power have one healthcare system at their disposal, whereas the mass of the population of Iran don't have access to this at all and are basically at the mercy of anything and everything that is out there. So what does the system do, or what do these low-level interest groups associated with elements and factions of the Islamic Republic of Iran do? They start to spin out scapegoat theories about the origins of the COVID-19, and who usually is the two groups that they pick on, the Zionists and the Baha'is. Now, none of the evidence that these people have put up is taken seriously, even by the media of the general mainstream media of Iran, because the mainstream media of Iran has not been propagating this narrative at all. Even those outlets that have been associated with the hardliners, they have not peddled and diffused this narrative about trying to blame the Baha'is for the spread of COVID-19,
right.
because even they realize that this is, the elements of this narrative are so porous and so obviously transparently false that they can't. But there's another layer to this, and that is the interests and agendas in Iran. And as I have been saying over the last year, the Baha'is and very powerful elements of the Islamic Republic of Iran are working together business-wise. They have joint financial interests. Mr. Farzam Kamalamadi went on record publicly claiming that he was advising the Iranian government how to cheat the sanctions. He was doing this from China, and he was also doing this from the Gulf. Now, currently, he's holed up in Bahrain. Apparently, the Emiratis want nothing to do with this guy anymore. But be that as it's made, the cat is out of the bag, that the Baha'is and the mullahs have been working together. Now, what does this mean tangibly? Let's, and I have mentioned this before, as many people on the ground who are in Iran, and especially in the capital of Tehran, who understand the local economy very well. And these are people who are working in that local economy, who own small businesses, etc. These people will testify that a huge element, a very significant element of the service economy of Tehran is in the hands of the Baha'is. Okay, so that means, like, for example, steelworks, concrete works, heavy machinery, transport. These sorts of industries are in the hands of the Baha'i. They're Baha'i owned, right? And the system knows this, and the system itself is dependent on these service industries. And so they are not trying to do anything to disrupt that relationship or trying to take, these industries away from the hands of these people. If they did, we'd hear about it, but they haven't done that. So that means that there is a great level of complacence between the system in Iran and these, Baha'i plutocrats in Iran right now. So that basically tells you that these stories that have been peddled in the minor elements of the Iranian media trying to scapegoat the Baha'is for the spread of the coronavirus are coming from very low-level outlets and don't really mean anything. Now, what people need to consider is that the human rights narrative of the Baha'is, which I have time and again underscored is exaggerated and in often cases, outright lies and untrue, is a lot of these human rights narrative have been pushed by the Baha'is, especially since the mid-'80s onwards, as a means of gaining leverage from the system of Iran. And we see the fruit of this leverage taking by the Baha'is now, where a great segment of the Iranian economy in Tehran is in the hands of these people. So, these human rights canards have actually worked. And so you can basically dismiss this hysteria and hysterics of Mr. Sen McGinn as having nothing to do with the actual dynamics on the ground of what is actually going on in Iran. There is no threat of any kind of a systemic pogrom against the Baha'is as a result of the coronavirus. As far as I am aware, there have actually been Iranian Baha'is who have been affected by the coronavirus. I've heard this from several places now. So, we can basically dismiss Mr. Sen McGinn and his anti-Iran campaign and take almost everything this man says with very modest grains of salt. This guy is a propagandist. He has had a bee in his bonnet, not just against the current system in place in Iran, but against Iranians for quite a long time. And, Sen McGinn has been literally everywhere and anywhere online for the last 20 years that I can remember and longer. Any campaign that has been targeting the Iranian people and the Iranian system, Mr. Sen McGinn has showed up, and in the capacity of defending what he claims to be the rights of the Baha'is. You have very, very seldom do you ever see Sen McGinn championing the rights of other groups. For example, the environmental movement in Iran has been relentlessly targeted by the system. There are many environmental activists that are in prison, who have been tried, who have been harassed by the system of the Islamic Republic. But you will seldom, if ever, hear a peep from the likes of Sen McGinn or any of his other Baha'i cohorts about this situation. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, when you said take it with a grain of salt, we don't even have to do that, because what I'm going to continue reading, and I'm not trying to confirm or deny what they're saying, I'm just giving the context, is that Sen is outright lying here. And then we can get in, and I'll demonstrate that, and then we can get into why he lied and what's at play. Anyway, this doctor was saying, okay, Iran's the third most affected country. What are the Americans doing in their labs? He says, dear people who listen to me, look up the Iranian Genome Project on the internet. Who conducted this project? The American Stanford University. I've been following this project for the past 5 years. 3 Iranians and 2 Americans at Stanford, who had $200,000 donated to the university by a Baha'i foundation, doesn't say which one, completely sequenced the Iranian's genome according to the conventions on genetic diversity and the preservation of countries' genomes. This measure is completely illegal. It violates international conventions. Now, if you go back, all he's saying is that there was Baha'i funding, from some institution. It doesn't really say which one. I don't even know what that's talking about. But if you go to Sen's article here, it says, thus far we have a bit of absurd anti-American, Sen says, a bit of absurd anti-American propaganda being repurposed by bringing Baha'is working at Stanford, quote, who are likely to be of Jewish origin, which makes it likely that the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic is a biological attack. But then Sen says, but what if there are no Baha'is or Jews working on the Stanford project? And then he goes, the YJC authors have thought ahead and insert a long history of the crypto Jews of medieval Europe and Iran who were first to convert, et cetera, et cetera. And so Sen's basically trying to say that there are no Baha'is working on the project. The thing is, with the quick Google search, you can find that, in fact, there was one. Now, I won't mention names because this person, could just be doing their best thing without really, medically, scientifically, without getting the politics at all. But this person pops up as not only having been being the lead researcher on the Iranian Genome Project, who is also, they don't actually say Baha'i, but say also taught Sunday school at the Houston Baha'i Center. So connect the dots.
Can you just?
But what's particularly telling.
Sorry to interject. Can you actually send me these links so I can put it into the description of the video?
But here's the kicker. Where you find this information about this person is on the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans website. And yes, I did look it up. Paul is, in fact, George's late older brother. Now, I'm not saying, like I said, this person who's working on this might be very smart scientifically and not so smart politically. But but it not only shows that Sen is outright lying about it, that the Baha'is have not done anything to counter this and saying, hey, wait a minute, why are you putting this false stuff out? But, I remember back, in my Baha'i days, there was one time, I could list a lot of examples. Here's one that comes to mind, where, I was looking for a new living arrangement because I had to move out. And a woman in the community also had a similar situation, and we were looking, or like needed a roommate or something. And so at some Baha'i function, we were talking about me moving in. We'd both being, it was totally platonic. But nonetheless, because this was happening at a function, and somehow someone, while we were discussing it, someone on the LSA heard about it. They, at this very event, convened a quorum of the assembly, since they had enough members, to basically tell us, no, you can't do that, and started to say about how, oh, this could make, it could make us look so bad. What if it got back to Iran and it got to persecute more Baha'is and blah, 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 blah. And yet here they are having someone okay with working for the Soroses, and they're not concerned about that part of their reputation at all.
Doesn't surprise me.
That's just...
But see, here's the thing with Sen McGinn, that you will never ever get an honest appraisal on multiple layers of a given situation from this guy. Sen is a propagandist. I mean, even in his book that I obtained, the argumentation that he provides is so porous and so, sterile in certain places that you kind of wonder about this guy. Here is a guy that was publicly humiliated by the Baha'i administration and the Universal House of Justice specifically. Yet, over 20 years on, since they actually disenfranchised him, this guy has jumped through every conceivable hoop to try to convince these people to let him back into the Baha'i community and to reinstate his rights. It just boggles my mind that anyone like that. This guy has no personal integrity at all. His whole life is punctuated by wanting to get back into the ranks of the Baha'is, and him going out of his way, to try to prove himself on the internet to these people that he is, worthy of their reconsideration. So he will, where his so-called journalism, which is not real journalism, where his so-called journalism and pseudo-scholarship is concerned, he will push the party line. And Sen McGinn has been instrumental. He was an instrumental figure on the internet in pushing the false narrative, the completely false narrative about this Ayatollah Masumi Tehrani, this completely fictitious Ayatollah that the Baha'is have claimed to be one of their own, a Ayatollah well-wisher of theirs. He has been at the forefront of pushing fake news and outright absurdities and lies about the situation of the Baha'is in Iran during all of these campaigns that were launched, about to try to free these 7 criminals of the Yaran that were imprisoned for espionage. He was at the forefront of all of this throughout that entire period of the last decade. Sen McGinn may have credibility amongst these hardline Baha'is, but anyone who has objectively looked at the activities of Sen McGinn on the internet knows that this guy, at the end of the day, is a propagandist and nothing else but that. He obviously couldn't make an academic career, so this whole thing with him getting kicked out of the Baha'i faith back in the late 90s so jaded him that he has spent the last decade and a half attempting in one way or another to try to get back into the good graces, more now 20-something years now, trying to get back into the good graces of the Baha'is by acting as their propaganda shill online. It just boggles one's mind about this guy. Go ahead.
Definitely. Although I bring this whole thing up not specifically to have anything to do with Sen McGinn himself, but just to illustrate the pattern, just as we saw with Dale Husband, with people like, if their names are even correct, Dennis Giron and Nate Abukiri,
Yeah.
these people who have had, some might be ex-Baha'is, some might be Baha'is on the fringe, kind of distant from the community, et cetera, some, had some passing relations with it, but nonetheless, it seems that these people are more or less there. Is that the biggest Baha'i propagandists are ex-Baha'is, Baha'is that have run in to some sort of conflict with the administration, etc.
Yeah.
And what that does is it create, well, for one thing, it shows kind of the schizophrenic nature that's going on, where you have all these lay Baha'is who are like, oh, we'd never do anything like this, blah, blah, blah. Whereas you have these other people that also, if it was just one person, no big deal, but you see this pattern.
Well, there's another thing. I mean, I don't want to beat it at a horse, but there's another line here, and that all of these people are white Anglo-Saxons.
Right.
I mean, this can also be said about Juan Cole. Juan Cole, who fell afoul of the Baha'i system. They were on the verge of declaring a covenant breaker. About less than 4 or 5 years later, makes a reassertion of his belief in Baha'u'llah. Does not disassociate himself from some of the questionable elements, his questionable anti-Babi elements of his own scholarship, that is still being cited by certain people as an authority. He didn't distance himself from that stuff at all. So, my question is, since, these people probably better than anyone, what is it in the psyche of the white American or the white New Zealander or the white Australian or the white Brit who has gone into this organization, found themselves in conflict with it, and then is put out, and then, sometime at some point down the line suddenly becomes a genuflecting drone, pursuing and pushing the agendas of these people. Dale Husband is an example. Juan Cole is an example. The Marshalls, Allison and Steve Marshall, are a great example of this. And Sam McGinn is another one. I mean, it just boggles my mind. When you have gone through the rigor in the way that you have, either the penny drops that this entire thing is a farce, has been farcical from the day dot, or, you don't push the envelope to the point where they kick you out. You have one or two options. There is no middle ground. And what is it about the mentality of these people? Well, they will answer with platitudes. Oh, we love Baha'u'llah. What the fuck is there to love about this guy? This guy was a thug. He was a liar. His writings are second rate. Compared to the corpus of the writings of the Bab and Sopa Azal, Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri cannot hold a candle to either the Primal Point or Sopa Azal in content, in depth, and in scope of writing. If we put the major Bayani figures aside, who can, in the history of Islamic mysticism and gnosis, who can Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri legitimately compete with? Nobody. Even the most low-level messianic claimant in the history of Islam has far more important things to say than Baha'u'llah does. Take, for example, Fazlullah Astarabadi, the founder of the Hurufi movement during the Timurid period. His Javidan Name Kabir, which recently was edited in the book The Words of Power, he had a lot more interesting takes on the nature of humanity and the nature of the world and the nature of God, on all of these things than Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri does. If you take a monumental figure like Ibn Arabi, Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri is not even a speck on the toenail of a Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, right? So, the question is thrown back to these people. You say you love Baha'u'llah. What is there to love about Baha'u'llah? You look at a picture of this man, and the man, scares the living daylights out of anyone. The first time I showed a picture of this Baha'u'llah to my daughter when she was only about a year old, she started to cry and ran out of the room. She was scared to death by this man. I've seen this reaction by other people, other children, etc. The vibe that you get from this picture from this man is just pure malevolence.
Oh yeah, I'll
Yet these
totally
people
agree, and to
love
me, I
this.
think that's why they don't allow the pictures, honestly. Um, but to me, since you mentioned they're all white Anglo-Saxon, I think that's the angle, and heck, this could probably, since you brought it up, this could probably be another whole podcast
Sure.
on analyzing that one. But just to say a few things there quick, what we do know about a lot of white folks historically is bullshit sense of superiority and a wanting to claim things for themselves that aren't theirs.
Yep.
What we generally call cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Now, the Baha'i faith will tell you, oh, we recognize Islam, but what it essentially does, and once you start studying Islam a little bit on its own, you realize very quickly that the Baha'i faith is repackaged Islam.
Yeah. Well, it's repackaged. It's a repackaged, not so much Islam, but it's a repackaged. It's a repackaged reform Islam of the 19th century minus Islam. I mean, it's not even the reform that Babism was talking about. It's a reform in the direction of the people like Muhammad Abdu, etc.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about in the sense like a lot of what you're told is a new Baha'i principle for this day and age, quote unquote. Like the Baha'is like to say, is actually something that you can find in Islam and the Quran.
Yeah, like the equality of humanity is a principle that is enunciated unequivocally in the Quran itself.
Exactly.
Prominently in the very first verse of the fourth surah of the Quran and elsewhere. The principle of equality of genders arguably is not even articulated in the Baha'i faith, at least not in the Kitab al-Aqdas, although they have made much fanfare out of it. Islam, kind of complicated the matter because on the one hand, in the Quran, men and women are equal, except men have precedence over women by the mere fact that their biology is sturdier than women, right? And there's that verse, "Ar-rijalu qawwamu 'ala an-nisa." Men are qawwamu has many denotations. Men have not so much precedence, but men have a strength of precedence over women. That is what that verse of the Quran means. And in a desert society like 5th, 6th century Arabia, that verse makes sense. And besides, Muhammad for his time was a real liberator. He forbade the female infanticide that was being practiced by these tribal Arabs. That was declared outright to be haram in the Quran. So in a sense, for his time, this man practiced what he preached, and he actually was a liberator of women in that tribal society, pagan tribal society of the Jahiliyyah period. In the Kitab al-Aqdas, you don't get that from the words of Baha'u'llah at all. There is a lot of equivocation over the issue of the equality of men and women in the Kitab al-Aqdas. Women do not inherit at the same level as men do. Women cannot serve at the Universal House of Justice. Whatever these liberal Baha'i pseudo-scholars have tried to argue that the word rijal can mean both women and men, the context, both the historical context and the immediate textual context of that verse in the Kitab al-Aqdas is very unequivocal that it's talking about men. It is not inclusive of women at all. This was not the case in the Bayan whatsoever. In the Bayan, men and women are equal. And furthermore, men have a layer of duty towards women, which women don't necessarily have to reciprocate towards the men in the marriage. Women are exempted, for example, from having to travel on a mandatory Hajj to the house of Shiraz, whereas men cannot be exempted. They must make that journey if they have the means to do so. So all of these things exist. I mean, when you compare the Bayan to the Kitab al-Aqdas, in fact, what Baha'u'llah does isn't so much even augment, the Quranic perspective on equality. He degrades the Quranic perspective on equality. And this is what boggles my mind, why you have these white liberals then reading a text such as the Kitab al-Aqdas and thinking that this Baha'u'llah was still the greatest thing since sliced bread, when he wasn't. The man, the laws and ordinances of the Kitab al-Aqdas be as it made that they are completely whitewashed and totally skewed versions of the laws and ordinances of the Bayan. Nevertheless, the reactionary nature of the Kitab al-Aqdas and a completely regressive nature of the laws and ordinances of this most holy book of the Baha'is is very obvious to anyone that looks at it. So I still don't understand how these people like Cole, like the Marshalls, like McGinn, like even to some extent, the likes of Dale Husband and even Michael Zagreb can still look at the Baha'i faith with a level of nostalgia, knowing full well that this stuff is reactionary bullshit, that a world that is constructed on the principles of the Baha'i faith makes the one that they complain about Islam look like a walk in the park by comparison. Even the Wahhabi version of it. This is, this is a totalitarian nightmare. Yes, the Bab in the Haykal ad-Din, said things like, for example, if a Bayani ruler can do so, they should purify the land of all non-Babis. Or there are ordinances in the Bayan such that, non-Babis are not allowed to reside in a Babi state. And, if they do, then their possessions can't be appropriated unless they convert to the Bayan. Yeah, these laws exist. I acknowledge that these laws exist. And to some degree, I even agree with them. But the fact of the matter is that all of this is contingent on the existence of a Babi state that hasn't existed. And probably won't exist. Maybe it will at some point in the future, maybe not. But it doesn't exist. Whereas there are injunctions and laws and ordinances in the Bayan that can be that you can operate, that you can fulfill without the existence of the Bayani state, without the existence of even a Bayani administration. An individual can implement these laws and ordinances such as worship, fasting, etc., the talismanic stuff, etc. All of these can be fulfilled by any individual on their own. But with the Kitab al-Aqdas, there is an insistence on a communal congregation existing in order for these laws and ordinances of Mirza Hussein Ali to operate. The whole House of Justice thing is one thing, and on and on and on it goes. And there is no flexibility in these laws and ordinances. When you read the Bayan, for example, the primal point offers a law or ordinances and says that, and then goes on somewhere either in that very passage of the gate of the Bayan or in another one, and says, well, if you're unable to do X, Y, and Z, this hukm or ordinance that I'm laying out here, do this instead. A good example of this is, if you cannot recite, this number of prayers, or you cannot recite these names of God to this number of times a day, well, you can do this one instead. There's always options being offered by the Bab. Not with Baha'u'llah. With Baha'u'llah, this is the way it is. This is what you must do. And if you don't do it, then you are violating my good pleasure. On and on and on it goes. I mean, I often wonder if these people like Cole, like the Marshalls, etc., have read this stuff, right? And know that, I don't believe for a second that Cole hasn't read it, or the Marshalls haven't read it, or even Sen McGinn hasn't read it. You cannot cherry pick. This is the whole gamut. The Baha'i faith, as the Baha'i faith, exists with the publication of this most holy book, right? Just as before the revelation of the Bayan, the Babi community was mainly considered, at least by the rulers of the time in Iran and elsewhere, to be a fringe development within 12 or Shiism. But the minute the Bayan was revealed, that unequivocal break from the Sharia of Islam is asserted. Same with the Kitab al-Aqdas. The minute that Mirza Hussein Ali, it's one thing that he made the claim, but once he then wrote this Kitab al-Aqdas, he has made that break with the Bayan, right? with the dispensation of the Bayan. So given this, if these people have any kind of fair-mindedness to sit down and compare, the two templates of ordinances, one between the Bayan, the other one between Kitab al-Aqdas, they will, if they are fair-minded people, they cannot fail to see that what the primal point proposes is a far more doable and actually a far more humane and better way of doing things than what Mirza Hossein Ali Nouri proposes. For example, this law about burning arsonists and branding thieves,
Yeah.
right? Now, this goes against one of the major ordinances of the Bayan, where the Bab says that no one should be maimed in any shape or form. Even the enemies of the Bayan should not be maimed. Even in a time of war, you should, if you are putting your enemies to death, you should put them to death in a humane way. You shouldn't, no one's limbs should be cut off, no one's heads should be cut off, no one should be branded, no one should be burnt. This is a very major ordinance of the Bayan. That, even in warcraft, that humanity, a humane way of doing things should be pursued. The Bab doesn't negate the reality of jihad. He just insists that it be done in a very gentlemanly and humane way. And that's the difference between Mirza Hossein Ali Nouri and the Bab. How can these people still continue on with this racket, with this whole nonsense about, the blessed beauty, this, that, and the other thing? The man was a fraud. The man was a fraud in his writings. He regularly lied. His lies, have been disclosed to any dispassionate scholar. E.G. Brown saw right through him. And other scholars who have come through the age have also seen right through this guy as well. Why cannot these people? What is that emotion within these people? What is that parasitic, program that is within these people where after they have broken formally from this cult, they are still nostalgic about it? I have no nostalgia for the Baha'i faith at all. This was one of, I've said this for years. This was one of the best things I ever did, was to make a clean break with these bastards once and for all. Go ahead. I've talked too much.
Oh, that's all right. No, I wanted to go on when you were talking about how the Bayan was far less rigid and, suggested practical ways, to get things done. That, again, that's something that actually you can find in Islam, but you certainly don't find in most modern incarnations of Christianity.
No.
Because and it's been a long time since I've read it, but there's the surah in the Quran where the prohibition on eating pork is mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just a few verses later after that, if I'm not mistaken, it says something akin to if one should eat pork out of hunger, but not to transgress, that surely Allah is most merciful.
Yeah.
So even going back into the Quran, we see less rigidity, but also not just the oneness of humanity, but even the idea of God sending different messengers, different prophets to various cultures. That's that's also Quranic.
Yeah.
Even in a sense,
progressive revelation, the whole concept of progressive revelation is Quranic.
Yes. Yep. Even when the Baha'is talk about a universal auxiliary language, you could almost, in a sense, argue that, Islam kind of sort of does that with Arabic.
Yes, it does. Yep. Yeah, Arabic became the lingua franca, especially during, arguably even now, throughout most Islamic societies. If you are a cosmopolitan religious person in the Islamic world, whether you be Indonesian or Malaysian, Chinese, Russian, Avar, Iranian, Turk, Syrian, North African, on it goes, that lingua franca, the scriptural lingua franca, is Arabic. Yeah, and so exactly. There is that universalization of Arabic that has already occurred within the Islamic dispensation. Yes.
So I almost therefore, because of this, go back to a psychology of whiteness, which just likes to appropriate.
Yes.
And hence, in that sense, the Baha'i faith is in a lot of ways an appropriation of Islam, but has the Christian, or maybe lay Christian, modern Christian, pseudo Christian rigidity.
I would say that it is a simultaneous appropriation of that version of Islam, but also an appropriation of Christianity simultaneously. Because as I've mentioned several times, the modern Baha'i faith, the hyphen Baha'i faith, resembles more a Protestant congregation than it does any other. I mean, if you want to compare the Baha'i organization to anything, it's any Protestant, evangelical organization. Now, what that means is that, the fixation of these sorts of people like McGinn, Cole, the Marshalls, etc., on the figure of Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri Baha'u'llah is basically a Jesus fixation. Since obviously people are not going to return to the church, although Walbridge did. Walbridge went from being a Baha'i to being a Presbyterian or an Episcopalian the next day. But with people like Cole, the McGlinns, etc., apparently in their own mind, their way is barred to go back to the church. So they turned Baha'u'llah into Jesus. Everything that normal Christians, or evangelical Christians especially, project onto the white Jesus, these people are projecting onto Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri. So it's a Jesus fixation that has been sublimated into this, 19th century figure, and founder of Baha'ism. And that is the only explanation that you come about the completely schizophrenic behavior of these people.
Yeah, well, and mentioning on the schizophrenia, just because also one thing that the white man loves is, and white women to an extent too, is money. And now I'm not sure all of these people are necessarily paid shills, especially someone like Dale, just because
Dale
you pay someone that dumb. But what it does is, if you have ex-Baha'is, fringe Baha'is, whatever, doing your dirty propaganda, it gives the body of the faith a plausible deniability. Yes. And thus it allows for the lay Baha'is to cut themselves off from this.
Yeah. Yep. And that is arguably what is happening here. But, see, from what I observed in the United States, is that, you have three kinds of Baha'is, basically. I mean, and I'm not necessarily talking about, the Persian Baha'is versus the American Baha'is, but just three types. There are the full-on administration hacks within a given community. Then there are those people who are midway between the administration hacks and lay people, and then there's the lay people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the lay people, a lot of the inactivity that occurs in Baha'i communities is usually from the lay believers who've never been elected to anybody, who were never asked to contribute to anything, and you may see these people, once a year at a feast and never see them again. Or you might not see them at all for 2 or 3 years, and suddenly they pop up at a feast at a Baha'i center somewhere. But it is the administrative hacks, and it is these people in between the administrative hacks and the lay people that are the constants within this Baha'i community. And their numbers are very small, and they're always the same people.
Yeah. To me, though, it also allows, though, for another topic we were going to get into, it allows for a cutoff, and it allows for a schizophrenic cutoff in terms of, your actual charity. I mean, I will admit that when, I was in the faith, that I did receive, some help from people, and I gave others help just because that's what you do for people, for your friends kind of thing. But outside charity is pretty much non-existent. even when,
Yeah.
the means are very easily there. Very
Well,
easily there.
as we were discussing briefly with Mr. Lucas Mannion on that thread,
Yeah.
arguably the concept of charity is completely gutted of any meaning in the Baha'i faith. Per those verses of the Akbats, number one, condemn beggars and destitute people, and then the verse that then prohibits, giving charity to destitute and people who are begging. And this is bizarre because in both the Quran and the Bayan, there's a special category that is defined as the Mustafin fil Ard, which means the dispossessed or the disenfranchised of the earth. And there is a special duty in both the Quran and as well as the Bayan by the believer who is endowed with some level of wealth to take care of these people. That you have a duty in these two faiths. That charity is a religious duty, and that if you fail, in Arabic the word is zakat, giving alms to the poor. The Bab uses the same term, but without actually using the word zakat in Arabic in the Kitab al-Aqdas, effectively what those two verses of the Kitab al-Aqdas do is abrogate completely the duty of an individual who is at one level of wealth to one that is at a lower socioeconomic level of wealth. But elsewhere, in other tablets, etc., then you have the Baha'i. I mean, obviously they realize, we made a boo-boo here in this verse. So then Baha'u'llah lauds, those who give to the poor, etc. But there's a schizophrenia here because nowhere does this occur anywhere in the Bayan or the Quran. The injunction and the command is explicit in both the Quran and the Bayan that those who are better off have a duty to give to the poor. And if you fail in this duty, you have failed in one of your major duties as a human being. But in the Baha'i faith, this is negotiable.
Yeah.
Right? It is completely negotiable, and this in itself is a bird's eye into what exactly are the motivations animating the zeitgeist, or rather the egregore of what this cult is all about. And it has nothing to do with any genuine form of religiosity, because even Christian, even your most lockjawed evangelical church, even when they subscribe to even if the rapture bunny is subscribing to the most ridiculous version of prosperity theology, still recognize the importance of charity in the words of Christ. And so they have to implement this, not that it's a law. I mean, although the Catholics had canon law about charity at one point. But in the Baha'i faith, there's a whole schizophrenia around this issue. Do we give, do we not give? And so when the issue has been addressed in the negative by the Baha'i administration and the Baha'i authorities, going all the way back to Shoghi Effendi and even Abbas Effendi, then it is natural for you to see that classism, right, and elitism is a inevitable outlook from these sorts of laws and ordinances that Baha'ism pushes. And then when you look at the Baha'u'llah's concept of private property, as opposed to the Bayanic concept of private property, which is more open-ended, you see that Mirza Hussain Ali Baha'u'llah is subscribing to the very same notions that were being critiqued by Karl Marx in the first and second volume of Das Kapital. And so, Baha'u'llah is the prophet of the capitalist, not the socialist. Whereas the Bab is very much a prophet of socialism, So then you have to ask yourself the question, despite all the pretenses to liberalism and equality and all the rest, where do these people, such as the Marshalls, the Coles, the McGinns, etc., what is occurring in their minds? How do they square the circle about this stuff? In the writings of Baha'u'llah, because just remember, the Baha'i faith effectively becomes the Baha'i faith from the moment that Kitab al-Aqdas is written. Prior to it, even what one could say from the period of 1863 to 68, when Baha'u'llah was making various claims, the Baha'i faith did not exist. And prior to that 1863 period, even though all of the Bayani sources testified that nothing actually happened in this garden of Najib Pasha, the so-called Garden of Rizwan in Baghdad, on the eve when they left it, All of these writings, like the Seven Valleys, Four Valleys, the Huri tablets, all of this stuff is prior to the period when the Baha'i faith effectively exists. This is not the period of the Baha'i. You're not looking at the Baha'u'llah of the Baha'i faith. I said this point blank several times to Juan Cole in private conversation and never got a straight answer, and sometimes he would completely ignore having to answer this question. But these people, these liberals, seem to have latched on to the pre-Baha'i faith Baha'u'llah, right?
Yeah.
It was still technically under the authority of Subh Azal at the time. And it's that Baha'u'llah that they latched on to.
Yeah, true. Well, let's bring to go some full circle back to the macro level with that. Here we have, regardless of what we might, what we've talked about with the current situation in Iran, you still have right now a nation there that is asking for sanctions to be lifted while we're having a pandemic.
Exactly.
And yet here the Baha'is are claiming, that we care so much about Iran, and yet aren't saying crap about, this way, if you're really going back to if you're really charitable, well, when the people are asking for a ceasefire for a little bit for help, okay, you do it, but you don't see Baha'is making a peep about this. You still see them on the whole anti-Iranian propaganda shtick.
Yeah.
And even Saudi Arabia has, one-upped them on this one. Not that I'm trying to glorify the House of Saud in any way, shape, or form, but you have, Saudi Arabia has actually declared a ceasefire against Yemen. During the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak. And, part of that might just be because they're saying 150 members of the royal family have tested positive. Maybe they're feeling a little wrath of God. I don't know, but
yeah, but this campaign that they run for this figure of theirs that was arrested in Yemen.
Exactly.
No one ever asked the question, what the hell were you people doing in Yemen during the middle of a civil war and then a American armed and Saudi implemented war on the people of Yemen?
Exactly.
What are you doing? What are you doing in Yemen?
Yeah, and there's also been this, I have a different take on what's being reported. Now, I don't know what the actual, crimes were. I'm imagining that it was something more than being a Baha'i, just because they haven't rounded up all of them. It's the same thing with, with Iran, where they're saying it's just about persecuting Baha'is, when even the the American National Assembly, it says that there are only 90 Baha'is in jail out of where they're claiming 300,000 people. Now look at the stats of, just black people in America who are in jail for having drugs planted on them. That number is way higher. But, apparently this guy was, you still there?
I'm here. Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, I just got a little blip on the screen. Sorry.
Okay.
This guy was sentenced to death, and supposedly for just being a Baha'i. I don't know what the actual crime was. I'm having a hard time looking that one up. But it was the decision of the death sentence was reversed a few days later, and I definitely saw a lot of Baha'is on social media wanting to say, oh, this is the power of prayer, and we prayed for this, and, et cetera, et cetera. I have a wildly different take on what might have happened here. And I'm in Hua Hin, Thailand right now, so I'm going to relate a little bit of fairly recent Thai history, because I think I admit this is somewhat speculation, but it really, to me, really seems to ring true. Maybe it will or won't for you. But just to give a little background to flesh this out, Thailand is one of the few countries that does have lèse majesté laws. And those are, a lot of Westerners scoff at them. For those listening who don't know, lèse majesté basically means you can't criticize royalty.
Yeah.
I know that it's past or present. I don't know if it extends beyond the Chakri dynasty, which has been in power for 250 years. But as much as the Western conditioning in me says free speech, there's also a part of me that realized that Thailand is a nation that has resisted colonization, and the Chakri dynasty is, shows that by being in power this long, and it is they are a symbol of pride among the Thais for that. So on the anti-colonial angle, I can definitely have some sympathy for the law. But to relate a little fairly recent history, in I think it was 2007, there was a Swiss reporter who, I think he might have gotten drunk, maybe not, but basically graffitized a few public pictures of King Bhumibol, and so he got arrested. They were initially saying 75 years. They reduced it to 15 when he confessed. They went through the whole trial, but then right after the trial, either as he was being let off or maybe after spending a day in jail or something like that, King Bhumibol himself pardoned him and just said, "Oh, I don't want anybody going to jail for criticizing me." Nonetheless, there is still, they went through the total trial, so there's still nonetheless the subtext, don't do that again. And I kind of, and I'm thinking that maybe whatever happened in Yemen is a similar thing. They went through the whole trial, they gave him a death sentence, they wouldn't repeal it, they let him stew in jail for a few days, and then said, okay, no, we'll let you go. Now, I don't think he's been let go yet, but the death sentence has been repealed. So I see, I'm wondering if it's the same situation there, where whatever he did, if it was maybe espionage, which is a much more serious crime, but if it didn't result in any actual security breach threat or something like that, or if he was maybe guilty by association of some other people who were really the main players, something like that, it seems to me like what happened was this trial was meant to put the fear of God in him. And then, and then they'd ease up. But the subtext again, whatever you did, don't do it again.
Look, if you have active Baha'is proselytizing in the middle of a war in somewhere like Yemen, you can bet anything you want that there was espionage going on.
Yeah.
I don't believe for 1 second anything that these people say. Baha'ism as a soft power of both the U.S. and Israel is a pretty well-established fact now. And so when you have these people in the middle of a real, bad war situation in the Middle East, and one of them is captured, this is not a human rights issue. And the question has to be asked, what the hell are you people doing there? And so, whatever the Baha'is have said about this situation can be very safely discarded as being fantasy, completely fantasy. You don't even have to go to the Its Majesty's laws, the laws about not criticizing monarchs. With Yemen, it's very straightforward. It's Yemen. It's in the middle of a civil war. There's a faction in the country trying to break away from its Saudi tutelage. Because just remember, it was the Houthis and not the lackeys of the Saudis who were responsible for this arrest.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that it was a lèse majesté type law he was busted for. I was just drawing the parallel of how a government can basically give someone the fear of God and then say, okay, we're going to let you go, but don't do this again.
Well, arguably, this was the Islamic Republic of Iran's initial policy towards the Baha'is in the early years after the revolution. But, even there, when they were doing that, I would say, especially after 1985, when things began to dissipate and there was more of a system in place, especially in Tehran, that the Baha'is just paid no attention to any of this stuff. And obviously, the Universal House of Justice and the Baha'i plutocrats wanted more martyrs,
Yeah.
because they for every Baha'i that was either imprisoned or executed in the first 5 years after the revolution, they made a capital like none other. Just let's remember, up until the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the Baha'i community, whether in Iran or outside of Iran, and especially in North America, was increasingly on the ropes in terms of recruitment. And the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and the fall of the Shah gave life to the Baha'i faith, the hyphen Baha'i faith, like no other event before it. And so they milked it, and they milked it, and they milked it, and where they could, they aggravated, they antagonized, and provoked the system. Eventually, the system in Iran figured them out, because I've spoken to a lot of people who were once part of the security establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran and then fell foul of it, whether we're talking about Dr. Hajarian or his subordinates or a great scholar like Abdullah Shahbazi, etc. And all of them have said the same thing. Once we figured out the game of these people, we became a restraint. I mean, the security establishment became a restraining hand on the more fundamentalist elements within that regime from going after the Baha'is. And they just allowed these people, to have a life. But the minute they tried to antagonize or to provoke, obviously, it would elicit the kind of reactions that they got. But in subsequent years, and especially as the Iranian economy went more and more and more under sanctions, and there was more hardship from the outside, it appears that the regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has been more amenable to dealing with these people, its former enemies, than almost anybody else. And I would even push this further back than before the sanctions, because I think, this genie was let out of the bottle during the Khatami years. Those 8 years of Khatami's presidencies, the kind of leverage and comeback of the Iranian Baha'i community was unlike anything that had been seen, during those years up until that point. And once that cat was let out of the bag, the system inevitably realized these people have money, they have leverage, we should work with them. We can maintain the narratives, our anti-Baha'i narratives, for the public consumption, right? For the lay supporters of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But where it counts, that means the officials within the system, whether we are talking about the faction of the reformists, which today are with Hassan Rouhani and Javad Zarif, or the hardliners, Ayatollah Khamenei and his supporters. Because, there is credible evidence, and this has come from a few Baha'is themselves, that they have people answering to them within the office of Ayatollah Khamenei himself, that they have infiltrated the office of the supreme leader himself. And they have bragged about this to several people. And we know that the Hassan Rouhani and Javad Zarif and that whole reformist faction has been sleeping with these people since the time of Khatami. So all of this talk now about persecution of Baha'is in Iran is just complete nonsense. There is no persecution of the Baha'is in Iran. Whenever people hear about these narratives about the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, they can take this to the bank, that it is nothing more and nothing less than the Baha'is in Iran trying to get more leverage, trying to claw more leverage, more area from the system. And that is all that it is. We've covered a lot of territory, Matt. This is going over an hour now. And I don't think, if we go any longer, we're going to lose some people.
I think so, but I think we've covered a lot.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but obviously we're going to be doing more of these in the future.
Definitely.
So with that, I thank the people who have been listening into this. And until next time, la hujja ila aliyan qabla nabiyin.